Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you happen to be joining us from. My name is Rob Reich. I am a professor of political science at Stanford University. I am the faculty director of the Center for Ethics and Society, the co-director of the Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society, and an associate director of the Institute for Human-Centered AI. I'm the co-editor of this new book called Digital Technology and Democratic Theory that we'll be discussing today under the title of AI and Democracy Pursuing the Possibilities. HAI and Stanford PAX are co-hosts of this event, and I want to welcome you to it. There is a Slido link that you will find on the website or in chat that will give you an opportunity. There's a QR code for you to ask questions during the event. And we will have a conversation with two of the main authors of the chapters in this volume about the interdisciplinary collaboration or cross-disciplinary collaboration to explore the urgent topic of the intersection between digital technology and democratic theory. I will introduce the two additional guests who will come to the screen in just a few minutes. But what I want to do right at the start is to frame a bit of the conversation and the aspiration about this particular book, and then introduce our additional guests, our contributors to the volume, and open up a conversation. We'll talk amongst the three of us for roughly speaking 30 minutes, and then get to your questions, which you can pose anytime you wish using that QR code on Slido. So we can begin with an observation that I think will be familiar to anyone tuning in, which is that the state of democratic societies, the health of democracy, seems to be fragile, seems to have eroded in the past decade or two. The organization called Freedom House, which assigns a rating to the democratic societies of the world in terms of their democratic health or ill health, just downranked American democracy considerably in the past year. And we can look across the globe to see the rise of authoritarian regimes, not merely on the geopolitical stage, but also in terms of their intervention, often through digital means, into the inner operation of democratic societies. It seems these days that the great digital technologies, so many of which have their origin at Stanford University and in Silicon Valley, are no longer a tool for increasing freedom, increasing democracy, but rather a tool for diminishing or corroding it from within. That helped to set a bit of the research agenda of this book, which was meant to try to take a view that goes beyond the initial early burst of boosterism or utopianism that attached itself to technology in the 1970s and 80s, and now the dystopian notes that are so frequently associated with the intersection of digital tools, digital platforms, and democracy itself. We wanted to bring together in a common workshop space for collaboration and discussion people from across philosophy, the social sciences, history, and then engineering, and in particular, people from the computer science background, in order to try to have a conversation that, quite frankly, doesn't happen as much as it should within universities, to take stock of how digital technologies and democratic theory and institutions intersect in powerful ways. I thought I would begin, just to set the stage, by reading a short excerpt from the opening chapter in the book, which is by Joshua Cohen, a political philosopher who used to be at Stanford University, a colleague of ours here, now is at Berkeley, and also has a position at Apple University, and his colleague, our colleague as well, Arkan Fung. This is the opening paragraph of their chapter, just to set the stage for the kind of aspiration of the volume that we wanted to move beyond. I like to think that this is one of the more arresting opening chapters of an edited scholarly volume in recent memory. Mobile technologies distract adults and depress kids. Twitter is a honeypot for assholes. Facebook and YouTube blend treacly cheeriness, insufferable self-display, and politically malignant deceit, delivered algorithmically to hyper-personalized addictive filter bubbles that generate massive ad revenue by absorbing attention and amplifying extremism. The open web is a vast, soul-sapping wasteland of sexual depravity, medical malpractice, a wormhole of darkness that eats itself, and the Internet of Things is an emerging panopticon. Behind all of this destructive work lies a small band of predatory monopolies animated by a toxic mix of swashbuckling ambition and self-satisfied moral preening. With our brains hacked, communities fragmented, truth crushed, and public discussion subject to suffocating private control, social media is rotting democracy from within. The bloom is off the rose of Silicon Valley. All of the wondrous technologies that have emanated from Silicon Valley have now been called into question. And what we wanted to do with this volume is to try to move the conversation beyond a surface level cynicism or skepticism about all of the seemingly obvious negative effects of digital technology and initiate a conversation that would bring people together from across the different disciplines in order to take stock of the bigger picture. We wanted to try to set a research agenda for the academy in multiple different disciplinary areas so that we would no longer have to abide by something as simplistic as Twitter is a tool for social mobilization that will increase freedom, or the internet is making democracy worse. We think there's a much more complicated story to tell, and that is part of the aspiration of this volume. Two of the contributors to the volume, in fact, one contributor and one co-editor with me is Lucy Bernholz. And we're going to be joined as well by Margaret Levy. I'll introduce both of them now and then turn the floor over to Lucy to give a short overview of her contribution, and then to Margaret, and then we'll have an open conversation. So Lucy Bernholz is a senior lecturer and the director of the Digital Civil Society Lab here at Stanford University. She's an historian by training, and I will not be embarrassing her. I think in fact I'll be complimenting her by saying she is both a philanthropy geek and a library wonk, or maybe it's a philanthropy wonk and a library geek. Her chapter examines a relatively underappreciated dimension of the intersection between democracy and digital tools and technologies, which is the realm of civil society, our expressive and associational spaces that are so important to the health of a democratic society, but that are not a formal part of the public institutions. Lucy, before I turn the floor over to you, let me introduce Margaret as well. Margaret Levy is a professor of political science here at Stanford University. She's also an emeritus professor at the University of Washington in the political science department, but her chief work these days is as the director of the Center for Advanced Studies of the Behavioral Sciences, and a wondrous place here at Stanford that has hosted scholars from across the world for more than 50 years. It is an exemplar of how interdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary work happens. Margaret was one of the people in the volume who not only took up the invitation to contribute, but then exemplified the cross-disciplinary spirit by deciding to co-author with two people outside her own training as a political scientist. So her co-authors, who aren't present with us today, are John Seely Brown, an engineer by training, and then David Lee, a professor in the computer science department at the University of California at Santa Cruz. Margaret's chapter has a wonderful and evocative title called, let me make sure I get it right here, Democratic Societal Collaboration in a Whitewater World. We'll get to that in just a minute, but Lucy, I want to turn the floor over to you first for an overview of your chapter about purpose-built associations.
Thanks, Rob. Great to see you. Great to see you, Margaret, and welcome to everyone who's joining from wherever you might be in the world and whatever time zone that is. This volume was an incredibly fun experience, and I think exemplifies how collaborative and interdisciplinary work actually takes real intention. Rob didn't mention the fact that this group of authors, 10 or 15 of us, met 3 times over several years working together to produce this. So I want to just reflect on what it takes to work this way and to think this way, because you're both bringing expertise and really being challenged in every element of that expertise from people who look at these issues from different perspectives. So the chapter that I contributed, which is in addition to the introduction, which I had the great privilege of writing with Rob and Ellen Landemore, our third co-editor, was it my effort to wrestle with what I often think has been the too simple sort of air quote solution to the changes we're experiencing in as we recognize our digital dependencies. We have had decades of analysis and thinking about what our dependencies on digital technologies are doing to our governing systems and to our market opportunities. And often that results in the recommendation of some kind of new nonprofit that will step in and solve X problem, or provide an opportunity for X solution. And I'm someone who studies civil society, philanthropy, and nonprofit organizations in particular. And to me, that view is just odd, because the nonprofit sector here in the United States, which is where I'm calling in from, I'm actually on the ancestral land of the Ramaytush Ohlone people at the moment, is by no means immune to the same kind of challenges that digital dependencies bring to governing bodies, public agencies, elected officials, the world of political and public governance, or to a company trying to make money. So what's missing from the literature, which I tried to make a contribution to, is what is happening to those organizational forms, organizational forms for associational activity in the digital age. And I feel very much I could spend the rest of my life updating this chapter, because I think we're at a really exciting moment in time in which civil society writ large, but the institutional elements of it, particularly again in the US not-for-profits, are wrestling with what does it mean to take on responsibility for managing digitized data with the same intention and purpose that they have long managed time and money. And there's, if I could evoke in your mind this wonderful old cartoon in which 2 scientists are looking at a chalkboard, and there's a bunch of equations on one side and a nice, neat little statement on the right side, and in the middle the chalkboard says, and then a miracle happens. I always think of that cartoon, because I think we've become so used to not-for-profit organizations as this kind of pre-existing thing that takes private donations of time or money, a miracle happens, and some kind of public good comes out the other side. So if you take that vastly oversimplified, somewhat ridiculous cartoon and think about what's happening to nonprofits when it's digital data going in and something coming out, that's the question I'm interested in. And what the chapter does is lays out a very much moment in time example of 3 different emergent forms that are prevalent and should be better understood, and people should be better aware of them whenever they're operating around digitized data and this idea of social good or public good or civil society. And the 3 models that I looked at are administrative data trusts, trusted data intermediaries in the nonprofit sector, and open source software repositories. And the chapter really tries to take apart those examples, which again, they exist, they're around us, they're not futuristic. But I actually think what I was trying to do is take them apart to figure out why they needed to be created, what they share in common, and what actually, if I were to make a prediction about where we're headed, I think we're in this great moment of institutional innovation, institutional change. I don't know that 1 or 2 or 3 or any of these examples will be a dominant form, say, in a few years, 10 years, but I think the elements of them, they're designed to purposely manage digitized data as a resource with an intention of some shared public good is will lead to some morphing, changing. Some of these may succeed, some of them may yield other models of them. But the nonprofit sector writ large, the institutional makeup of civil society, I believe, is going to be very different, needs to be very different than it has been for the last 130 plus years, because there's a sort of a new resource in town, and one that brings both opportunity but also very significant harms and challenges, and that is this massive amount of digitized data we have on people. So that's what the chapter is looking at.
Thanks, Lucy. I can't wait to get into some questions. I'm going to flag already. I want to talk about Shoshana Zuboff and surveillance capitalism, about civil society as an arena for the private efforts to create public goods. And we'll get into data as a core resource as opposed to money that's given away. All right, but first, over to Margaret for an overview of her chapter, along with John Seely Brown and David Lee.
Sure. So first of all, I want to thank Rob and Lucy and Helene for giving me the opportunity of writing this piece with two people I might never have written something with otherwise. We met regularly in JSB's, John Seely Brown's garage, in addition to our regular meetings as a larger group, but the three of us would meet in his garage, which I should say is not only next door to my house, but is also around the corner from the Hewlett-Packard garage. I can't say that what we did together will have the same kind of impact. In fact, I can assure you it will not, but still it was fun to be sort of inspired by those thoughts. What we were really trying to contemplate, and this gets to the title, The Whitewater World, which is a concept which has really been developed by JSB and his regular co-author, Ann Pendleton-Julian, was a whitewater world is the world we live in now, where it's very unpredictable. If you think about the past, we've had sort of big ships that have to turn around, it takes them forever to turn around in the ocean. We've had sailing boats where it's fairly easy, but you're dependent on the wind. And right now we need to know a lot about context, a lot about things that are going to come at us all of a sudden. And that really thinks about whitewater rafting and the kinds of skills we need and the way we have to think about the world, which means that we really have to be in a world of constant experimentation. And that links to the democratic part of this, which is thinking about Dewey's democratic experimentalism. We've got to be constantly trying new things and figuring out what works in this world. And it also involves, even though the whitewater kayaking analogy is of a single individual in a kayak, we're really thinking about a much larger set of collaborations and how we can create those societal collaborations that are both democratic and use technology. So we may share some of the views that Rob expressed from Cohn and Fung's introductory piece, but we really want to consider here the possibilities that technology provides, not just the pathologies it creates. And, I think it's an open question, but I think there's some real opportunities and some real capacities that we can be given. So one of the other things that really concerns us about the whitewater world is how do we skill and reskill and constantly reskill people to cope? And this is another link to technology. So we're interested in where technology can create democratic possibilities and where it can create learning possibilities and where it can skill and reskill. So what we really what we were considering is the extent to which online group collaborations, so the absence of a water cooler and face-to-face interaction, can create participation and engagement in civic life, can promote civic skill acquisition, can help solve problems, because that's a critical part of what we have to do. And then what I really brought to this is the creation of what John Alquist, my regular co-author, and I call an expanded community of fate. How do we create relationships among people who share have a shared destiny, fate, F-A-T-E, not faith, who really have to worry collectively about the world. And how do we ensure that, one, they can communicate, that they can cooperate, but that their cooperation is for the public good, that it's expanded and that it's inclusive. We all have communities of faith. They can be very narrow. They can be for very negative purposes. We want to make sure that these actually promote the public good. So the first thing we did in this piece, beyond developing this set of arguments, was to look at some case studies to see what has developed in the world. We looked at 4 different kinds of things. One was MoveOn in the US and GetUp, its Australian variant, which certainly used technology to get people to think about voting, to make contributions, but became, in the MoveOn case, became extremely irritating and certainly didn't create an expanded community of faith. GetUp really started to think about, in Australia, started thinking about how to engage people, train leaders, began to push that boundary a little more, but not sufficiently. We looked at SafeCast, which was developed to deal with the terrible crisis in Japan caused by the nuclear facility falling apart and blowing up. And that was a great case of solving problems and creating a community of people and solving certain kinds of informational issues. But it had limits in terms of skilling and reskilling, among other things, and democracy. It really relied on a narrow group of experts who did a phenomenal job. This is not a criticism of them, but it was not established on a set of principles that could really promote skilling and reskilling or create full participation in the process. Code for America, started by Jen Paca, takes it a little farther. It's clearly about problem solving. It creates teams. It creates a kind of participatory environment. But again, it's not quite as expanded and as expansive as we wanted. And it's not really focused on, again, on an expanded community of faith. It's much more about problem solving. So each of these brought something to the puzzle, but none of them are doing all of what we wanted to achieve. David Lee, who is a young computer scientist and very smart and innovative, is running a whole series of experiments right now in which he's really trying to shift the hierarchy that's based on technological skills, to create a more participatory environment, to really create a schooling possibility and a learning possibility, as well as reach people who would not otherwise engage with each other and begin to create an expanded community of faith. But these are experiments and we still have to bring them into full practice. I want to end with thinking, well, let me make one other point and then let me make my final point. Part of what motivated me to participate in this project and in this article is that I think that it's really important, and this is one of the programs at CASBIS, is to think how we envision a better future and how to create what we've been calling at CASBIS a new moral, political, economic framework. So I think this is, bringing technology into this and bringing it in the right way is very much an important part of that process. And it has to be democratic and it has to be expansive and reskilling. I think the experience of COVID has helped us learn more than we knew when we wrote this article about the technology possibilities in terms of creating a democratic, inclusive, and expanded community of faith. We learned that we don't need a water cooler. We couldn't even go to a water cooler if we wanted to, though it's often better, and we learn this too, if we have one, if we have some ways to actually build some solidarity based on face-to-face interactions. But we want to go beyond that, and technology allows us, and has allowed us, as we learned this past year, under certain circumstances, to build some solidarity in communities technologically. What we've done with Zoom is remarkable. It's certainly limited. We certainly could do more, but we've been able to build some things we might not have otherwise done across all kinds of time zones, like this moment here. But there are also limits. Technology, as we keep being reminded, can produce and support echo chambers and bastions of misinformation and problematic communities of fate based on weird conspiracy theories and other forms of exclusivity. But still, I want to say, and based on this article and this work with this whole larger team, I'm actually quite optimistic, in part because of the promise I've seen, and in part because we as humans need new ways to solve these problems, and we as humans are incredibly creative at doing that.
Thanks so much, Margaret. So I want to invite Lucy into conversation about this as well, and I'll begin with a comment or an observation about these opening remarks you just made, Margaret. Describing the different ways that technology can be used as a kind of problem-solving device. That similarly is a way to describe democracy itself.
Yes.
You evoked Dewey there as one of the originators of that. I think as well of Audrey Tang, a minister in Taiwan, who describes democratic institutions as a technology for certain types of social problem solving. And that's one of the powerful ways, at least to me, it seems, that what technologists do and the mindset they bring to problem solving is not merely compatible with, but of a similar mindset to how we should think about designing democratic institutions and the productive intersection then between digital technology and democratic theory. I wonder, since this is co-hosted by HAI, the Human Centered Artificial Intelligence Institute, there are already a bunch of questions about how an AI future is going to be a job-destroying, human agency replacing or displacing future. And I don't think either of you talked directly about deep learning or AI in your chapters, but thinking about the digital technologies that are simply algorithmic models or things that involve platforms for aggregating the voices and inputs of many, many people. HAI is committed to a future in which the frontier of artificial intelligence will be human augmenting or human enhancing, human supplementing rather than human displacing, a problem solving orientation to map onto the problem solving orientation of democracy. Anyway, that's an invitation for either of you to reflect on democracy as the technology and digital tools and platforms as kind of plug-in opportunities for the ordinary operation of democratic institutions. And Lucy, I think of your chapter of all the different examples, the data intermediaries and things, and Margaret, your description of either Code for America or SafeCast or the basic task of reskilling or upskilling. We shouldn't view this as the corporate interests of society to find a new market niche. We should view this as a problem-solving orientation to a social dilemma that presents itself to us quite profoundly. So again, that's where I see all these intersections can be quite profound. Thinking about democracy as the technology and not ceding all of that ground to the engineer. In any case, that was maybe more a statement than a question, but Margaret, why don't you start?
Yeah, I think I think the way to think about it is, I'm not sure I put it quite the way Audrey Tang does. So I'm so glad you mentioned her, and I'll come back to her in a second. But I think it's really, what we tried to do in our chapter is to say that there's some goals that we really want to achieve, and technology can help us achieve them.
Right.
And one is a very different kind of democracy than we're experiencing right now. So I've been deeply involved, as I'm sure you both have too, with the growing literature on relational equality.
Yes.
And how that has to be very much, and it's about capacities and it's about opportunities. And it's not just about democracy in the sense of one person, one vote. It's about really realizing the potential that people have to bring their voices to bear and their creativity to bear, and to reconcile the differences as we try to solve collective problems. And technology has an incredibly important role to play in that, but it's got to be managed by us in a way that helps. And so some of those algorithms are great and some of them are not so great. And we know that. I don't want to, rehearse all of that. I'd rather turn to Audrey Tang.
Yes.
And those who don't know who Audrey Tang is, she's this, she basically ran the COVID response in Taiwan and created a system using technology that gave people not only information, not only a place to ask questions, but a really participatory space to engage with this epidemic and with the knowledge we have about the epidemic that comes from all kinds of experts, as well as people's lived experience on the ground, to create a process which brought in, as Rob knows, one of the things I've studied most of my life is the conditions under which people will comply or refuse to comply with extractive government demands. And this, of course, the pandemic is an extreme example of an extractive government demand on all of us. And Taiwan managed to avoid lockdowns. It managed to keep its economy open, and it did it in a technocratic and democratic way.
Right.
I first ran into Audrey Tang, and then I'll stop at Radical Exchange, a big Radical Exchange meeting, which is an organization that Glenn Weil and others started. And what I loved about that meeting was Audrey Tang was probably the most elaborated version of what was going on. But there were so many examples in so many communities around the world with democratic experimentalism of trying to figure out how to control the technologies for their own purposes and how to use the technology to create things that needed to be done to improve the societies in which they live.
Yep. Lucy?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think the interesting thing too here about this possibility of community intentioned technologies. I'm making that term up on the spot, as you can tell. But is that both Margaret's chapter, Margaret JSB and David's chapter and my own chapter are looking at this third space, this civil, something that's happening largely at somewhat outside of direct government control or direct corporate control. And that's not an accident. That the civil space is where we can do that. And what's absolutely necessary, I think, is recognizing that the kind of institutions and the things that structure them and their responsibilities and literally what they prioritize and all of that is up for grabs. And there's this opportunity that's been underway for quite some time of using technologies to create new associational spaces. And what I think we're beginning to see in abundance is those, I have to put a word to it, so I'll call it an institution, but some of these things, there's no institutional bounds that we would recognize. Open collectives, for example, which built upon open source technology to say, if there's 12 of you who want to get together and do something, and you want to track your resources for doing it, here's a way to spin it up, spin it down, you're done. And you decide how you're going to govern that and what's going to happen. And it exploded because it's a very useful thing for people to be able to come together and problem solve in the Dewey democratic definition thereof. What I think we don't want, I think we need to understand this kind of innovation explosion in this space in a way that can ensure that true democratic principles of equity, inclusion, voice are not, rhetorical toss-asides.
Right.
And as one of the great important insights of the lived experience, co-learning, skill building that the chapter speaks to is all of that expertise is needed. And that's hard to set up. That's easy to say and very, very hard to do. And the more we can see existing associations and organizations taking that on, I think the better off we'll be, because we should be well aware. There's no reason for anyone to not be aware at this point of the ways in which these can be exclusive and exclusionary.
Yeah.
The other point I want to make that follows on that is I think that the technology has been largely used to split the demos. And I think we need to rethink it and think about how it can be used to create a more inclusive demos.
Yep. Fantastic. Actually, Margaret, that's a perfect sort of leaping off point for me to introduce something that was on my mind to bring up as a last question or topic from my end before we move to the audience questions. We hope collectively that the volume we've produced, Digital Technology and Democratic Theory, not merely provides some interesting insights and an orientation to thinking about these intersections across disciplinary lines, but also sets a research agenda for many other scholars. And the introduction to the volume that Lucy, I, and Hélène Landemore wrote tries to lay out 3 different areas of a fertile ground for research that was not the decision of the editors to sort of impose upon everyone collaborating, but rather emerged from our conversations over the course of 18 months. One of those areas, apropos what you just said, Margaret, is how it is that digital tools and platforms can affect the demos, the people who are meant to be the primary source of a democratic society itself, government of, by, and for the people. Hélène Landemore's chapter about her project called Open Democracy, and she has a wonderful singly authored book about of the same title, explores how these digital tools can expand the demos, not merely bring equity to an existing demos. And that's one super important research agenda. A second is something that you could call the informational conditions of a healthy democratic society. And that gets into both public institutions, civil society, journalism, media, a whole host of really interesting questions, which invite the efforts of social scientists, of political philosophers, and of course, people who build tools for communication. Social media networks are just one example of that. And the third area that we identified is the possibility of new or different expressive and associational spaces, this intermediary position between the market and the government. I wonder if either of you would like to then comment on your own experience in the conversations that we had over the course of 18 months, or now that the book is out, about the pleasures and also difficulties of cross-disciplinary research. And if these are, as we hope, as an editor, I'll say, genuinely important, socially urgent places for more research to happen. Can you say a little bit about your own experience in the workshop conversations? And Margaret, I'll invite you to go beyond that, because of course at CASBIS, you are staging these all the time. That's your day job every single day, and you've got tons of experience there to weigh in on that. Lucy, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So let me, I actually have come to believe, reflecting on that experience now of, a good year ago that we were actually in rooms together, more than that. 2 things that I think are really important. And I think that the experience of the last 18 months for many people who would have liked to avoid having to think this way, they can no longer avoid thinking this way, which is, what are the possibilities? How can we bring people together and bringing all of their different types of expertise to produce something beneficial, recognizing that the kinds of risks or harms or threat modeling behavior that technologists often undertake apply to anything you might be inventing, anything you might be creating at this point. I mean, I read sometimes I feel a little bit like I have 2 brains when I read about extraordinary advances in AI, for example, that are very targeted at specific medical problems, or they're very, very domain specific. And I worry about they get loose, right? They get used for other purposes. And how is that being thought about? And I think the assumption can be they will get loose. These tactics. And so how do we build in a processes and a norm and a set of responsibilities that engage from the beginning with the possibilities of technologies built for one purpose being used by others for other purposes, recognizing that that has basically been the story of technology.
Yeah, Lucy.
Whether that's an institution or a bit of software code.
Right.
And I think the experience of working together was oftentimes when you bring people together from different disciplines, and especially if it's a solely scholarly community, the initial aspiration, sort of the throat clearing that has to happen is what's wrong with your way of viewing the world? Right. This is the way to view the world. Your way falls short at X, Y, and Z, right? Yeah. And maybe that always is going to have to happen, so we just build that in. But when you can get past that and say, no, you know, I can add to your way of seeing with this way of seeing, with this set of skills, with this set of capacities, and where would that take us? Those structures and spaces for that to happen are few and far between. They may exist more so in academic settings than in academic and real world or real building settings or practical settings. But to the degree that those can be built and sustained, I think there is evidence that you can in fact get to the possibilities that build on multiple types of expertise. There's a plethora of examples at local levels here.
Yes. Yep.
But recognizing that that may be the way we need to go forward.
Yep.
Our institutions aren't yet built for that. We're early in that.
Can I hop in just to add an observation of my own experience since we completed the volume, where I've been spending a lot more time with the broad community at HAI, which includes, of course, some of the most audacious and interesting AI scientists in the world. The idea that AI in particular has had these narrow kind of accomplishments. Look, it can beat the world's checkers champion. Oh my gosh, it can beat the chess champion too. Or, as you put it, the sort of domain specific things. And then your description, Lucy, was it could get loose and be used for other purposes. An obvious example of that, I think you have in mind, Lucy, is computers are now extraordinary at facial recognition and computer vision, which has wonderful use cases when we can unlock our phones in privacy protected ways, perhaps simply by pointing them at our faces, and devastating use cases when a company like Clearview AI or others decides to deploy it on camera devices for every single police officer, or military applications for drones. And the kind of bet of the volume, or the hypothesis of the edited volume, as well as, I'd say, all of our respective institutions at Stanford, CASBIS, the Digital Civil Society Lab, HAI, is if you only leave the technologists alone, the AI scientists in the lab, or if you just let the philosophers hang out together in the philosophy department, you won't find the most creative, interesting ways of forging the new moral political economy and the new ways of thinking we need for the world to avoid the negative use cases. And the thing that I've learned by hanging out at HAI is it's not just these dual use or multi-use technologies that gets deployed for different purposes, but the research agenda for many AI scientists is explicitly to achieve general machine intelligence, where it doesn't need to be deployed by a human for some other purpose, but rather it itself is capable of multi-domain thinking. And if we don't find a way to impart our human values, our social collective preferences to machine intelligence, that portends a potentially worrisome future. All right.
So
go ahead, Lisa. Yeah.
Into that, I mean, I think there's two things to take from it. I fully agree with you that the pursuit of that technological capacity should be deeply informed from the get-go.
Yes.
By humanists and philosophers and people with lived experience of
But it has to go the other way around too. So part of what I learned from this project, I chose to work with two engineers.
Yep.
Two computer scientists. I'm not literate enough in computer science to give that discipline the help that they need. So it's, part of the process of really good cross-disciplinary work. It's not just the throat clearing.
Yeah.
Not to use the AI term, but it is a kind of deep learning that
Yes.
we need to do of enough of each other's disciplines so that we can engage properly.
Yes.
And that is not easy. And then I think the best way to achieve it is problem solving.
Yeah.
That if you create a common set of concerns that you're all working on, it can be academic, intellectual, it can be, in our case, trying to build democratic societal collaborations that would expand the community of faith. Whatever it is, that's the way you really get at that. You have to learn enough of the other's skills so that you can have a respectful conversation. And there's much too much of a presumption on the part of the social scientists and the humanities that the other should learn theirs.
Yes.
And
Right.
that's giving in that we're easy to learn because we're not. And that we don't have to learn theirs. We can help without that. And it really has to be this new way of thinking, of educating people like what you're doing in your class, Rob, in your 3-person class. We really have to reskill ourselves. Upskill ourselves.
I didn't mean to imply that it goes one way because I think there's actually a third dimension here.
I'm just trying to get into the conversation, Lucy.
Okay. But there's a third dimension that actually I didn't realize until we three started talking, which is that while all of the people who contributed to this volume are academically situated in some way, there's a bunch of weird academics in this mix. People who've left academia and come back, people who've left academia and not come back, people who work in journalism, people, so I think the experience of people operating in and living in outside of the academic frameworks altogether, we captured some of that by virtue of the mix of people in the volume, but that kind of learning the other expertise speaks specifically to the expertise of people in the world being affected by these tools and engaging them throughout a process like this as not just, use case testing or personas or things like that is also absolutely critical to this. And there are examples. The UW Tech Lab, Policy Lab has figured out ways to do this in more meaningful ways. But really that involvement of lived experience from a very diverse set of people is critical.
All right, I want to turn to the questions on Slido. There's one question which has been upvoted by a significant margin more than any other. And Margaret, I want to start with you because I think that your own long-standing research agenda is ideally suited for at least an initial response to this. The question is from Alexis Mallet. How can AI or substitute, if you wish, digital technologies serve long-term interests when democracy structurally seems doomed to mostly serve clientelistic or special interests?
Well, we start with the fact that democracy doesn't have to do that.
Correct.
I'm not going to disagree that, unfortunately, and I've written lots about this. Unfortunately, the way in which democracy has evolved, particularly representative democracy, because we've needed to find means by which we can channel people's voices and not just have one. We're not ancient Greece. We're not, and even there, it was really an elite that was making the decisions for the whole. So we've had to find processes and institutions, and we've backed ourselves into a bit of a corner where we've given certain groups far more power than others, and done that with institutional designs that were meant to serve one period and aren't so well serving another period of time, and encouraged a lot of clientelistic politics, some of which can be positive, much of which can be problematic. So the real issue is, how do we redesign democracy and then use technology to help with that? And to facilitate those kinds of, and so now I'm just reiterating what I said before and what Lucy has been saying about how we really use democracy then and the technology to make sure that those voices have a place. But it does require some serious institutional redesign. And that is really, I would say, the fundamental question is not about clientelism, it's about who has power. And whether that power is relatively evenly distributed or not. And it's not, because of our institutional designs. And so we got to change some of the institutional designs, and we've got to use technology to help us maintain a more equitable allocation of power through voices, participation, engagement, and a whole variety of other things.
Yeah, terrific. As you described that, Margaret, it reminded me of several of the moments in our workshop conversations in which we had realizations along the lines of something like, geez, people who are in democratic theory or social scientists like you, Margaret, who have been studying the long histories of democracies over the course of, at a minimum, centuries, and in some cases even longer. Computer science didn't even exist as a discipline in 1950. And like, what happened 2 years ago is already outdated. And like, have the democratic theorists, like, when's the last time you learned something brand new? Was often a kind of a conversation we had, and pointing to, say, John Rawls as reinvigorating political philosophy back in 1971 with a theory of justice often seemed to a computer scientist as like, that's the latest, so some version of that. The time horizons here, both within how we think about technology and democracy and within the academy, of the pace of research and the reference points we call upon, that's part of this complicated ground of mixing people together and trying to learn each other's languages and reference points. But it's also, I have to say, where the excitement is.
But Rob, the other piece of it is, meanwhile, the world is trying things.
Yes.
And if we don't pay attention to, that's why I love that Radical Exchange meeting, for example, several that I've attended, because there's so much experimentation going on, and we've got to learn from it, and it's got to inform the way we think. So yes, democratic theory changes slowly, and probably should. I mean, I don't think we should necessarily immediately redo everything.
Right.
But, well, there are a lot of things I think we should immediately redo, but that's another question. But I do think that we need to be alert to what's actually happening on the ground.
Yep.
And academics sometimes forget that.
Agreed. All right, I'm going to get one more question in here from Ryan Kearns. And Lucy, I'll start with you on this one. I'm curious if you could touch on the following relationship. Malignant effects arising from tech in itself, so for example, say Twitter and information, versus malignant effects from the corporate incentives that surround tech, such as Twitter's ad revenue model. Is it possible to decouple these, or do they mostly always co-occur? And the reason I thought of you for this, Lucy, is that when we think about Zuboff's surveillance capitalism, a political economy of how the profit-making incentives work, part of your work in the lab and in the chapter has been to point to this other domain in which the corporate incentives don't operate in the same way.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the moment, given the pervasive nature of commercially produced technology, those two things are so entangled, it's very hard to detangle them for most of us. There's a very small, and Rob, you know this, when we named the Digital Civil Society Lab, the Digital Civil Society Lab,
yep.
we were doing it very deliberately to point to something that needed to be looked at, but we weren't entirely sure whether it even existed.
Yes.
It was like the right thing to name a lab after, something aspirational, which is, what is this space where we are digitally dependent and fluent and supported and activated, but we aren't captured by the values of either the commercially centric political economy
yep.
or the government centric political economy. Because as I understand democracy theory, and I'm not a theory, not one, that's what civil society is all about. It has a different set of values, norms, assumptions, purposes, and structures. And so I think it's not exclusively the domain of the kind of experimentation that Margaret's talking about, not by any stretch of the imagination, but it is one place where a lot of that is happening and is deliberately considered it's tough. It's hard to resource financially, pay for a lot of this stuff, but there are efforts, there's success stories, there's lots of things happening. And in fact, to the Zuboff comment, they're often hand in hand with proposals for alternative economic structures.
Yeah.
So the great mutual aid boom of 2020, which I will definitely put in air quotes,
Right.
is partly, I think, should be looked at closely as an example of that. It's not the use a Google Sheet, bring your neighbors together, let's do something just during the pandemic, but the historical, political, economic roots of mutualism and mutual aid in a digital age are a deep expression of there can be different.
Yep. That makes me reflect upon something. All of us have these locations at the moment, all three of us, within a university, a particularly well-resourced and prominent university, an excellent university. And something I think we all agree on here, I hope we agree upon, I want to hear if you think otherwise. Lucy, as you point to associational life and civil society as not the exclusive, but one of the certainly essential domains of civic experimentation for social problem solving, to connect it with Margaret's words from earlier. Yes, we see R&D and experimentation in industry, commercial industries, trying to find new market niches and beat the competitor and provide various ordinary goods and services. But when we think about civic experimentation, sometimes the corporate sector is good for that, but civil society is one of, as you put it, Lucy, a purpose-built space. And let's remind ourselves that universities are part of civil society, places where the history of the production of knowledge and the pursuit of truth and the conservation of knowledge over time, a massive global public good, the research function of universities as embodied by, in just a small way, our research enterprise in bringing people together, is also a site of experimentation on behalf of social problem solving. CASBIS, as I say, I've referred to it many times already, Margaret, is an exemplar of exactly that type of orientation. So Margaret, why don't I give you the last word as a way of offering you a chance to say something about CASBIS too.
I don't really need much of a last word here. I mean, I think this is a really exciting conversation. And as you know, this book and what I do in the world represent a common theme of I'm deeply engaged with and deeply committed, and think we all should be, to a kind of transdisciplinary approach in which we develop our own variants of expertise, but in the ultimate end of working with others who bring other forms of expertise to bear to solve common problems that will improve society. And that's what CASBIS was founded on well more than 50 years ago, I have to say. It was founded in 1954. And it's supposed to be bringing multiple disciplines together to think about significant societal challenges. And we have learned so much in the last nearly 70 years about how to do that. Starting from, a model of individual scholarship to one that now really has to be based on the kinds of collaborations that both of you have been encouraging and that we try to emulate and create at CASBIS.
Yeah. All right. Well, with that, let me thank everyone for joining us, for our hosts at HAI and the Digital Civil Society Lab at Stanford PACS. I'll conclude just by thanking Margaret and Lucy for the stimulating and fantastic conversation. And then for everyone still listening, both the Digital Civil Society Lab, as well as the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, and of course, HAI as well, we have lots of programming. You can go on our websites to find more such programming. And we also have lots of fellowship opportunities. So for those of you who are interested in perhaps joining our intellectual communities, you will find many opportunities to do so online as well. So thank you so much for joining us. And
thank you, Rob.
See you again soon.
Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Margaret. Thanks, HAI.